the Fillmore Street Soul Rebellion. And we want you to come along with us and put your weight on it, baby. All right, put your weight on it. Put your weight on it.
Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP 103.3 in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Salagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world. Wayne Price is a longtime anarchist author and currently a member of the Bronx Climate Justice North and the Metropolitan Anarchist Coordinating Council, or MACC, in New York City. After reading his book, The Value of Radical Theory, an Anarchist Introduction to Marxist Critique of Political Economy, out from AK Press in 2013, I got excited to talk to him about his views on anarchists engaging Marxist economic concepts and some of the historical conflicts and engagement between Marxism and anarchism. No, we don't talk about the First International, really. We do talk about his political trajectory from a pacifist anarchist in high school through Trotskyism and back to anarchy. Wayne also shares about common visions of what an anarchist economy might look like, how we might get there, class and the intersection of other oppressions, and critique of state capitalism. Wayne sees the oppressed of the world having a chance during this economic freeze to fight against re-imposition of wide-scale capitalist ecocide by building libertarian, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, and heterogenous future societies in the shell of the old. You can find his books, Anarchism and Socialism, available from akpress.org, and The Abolition of the State, Anarchist and Marxist Perspectives, through a fine independent radical bookstore in your area that you could choose to support and could probably use it. You can find some of Wayne's writings up at the Mirror for Anarchist Library, as well as the platformist Anarchismo Network, the Anarcho-Syndicalist Review in print and online, and the Utopian Journal, which I think may be out of print.
TFSR is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. Here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
The home of theory and real talk, that radical hip-hop. The beat don't stop till every last cop drop the badger off a cliff like I give a fuck.
Wait, hold up. That was 2012 style. It's still fuck the police, but where are we going?
This ain't the motherfucking Chapo frat house. They call me a woke Joe Rogan, the way I bring them facts out. But I don't sit down and break bread with Nazis. I break beats to break borders and destitute economies. Out here on a hauling commune where the cops can't find you and them pine trees calm you. Collective liberation, food autonomy and anarchy. Not an identity, some practices to get free. I do this shit cause I like to read and explore what it means to be a real human being. In the Anthropocene, we stay pushing, expanding imagination, think beyond the quote-unquote revolution. Let's get free in the here and now and recognize the little's work from Napoleon to Mao. Shout out the Zapatistas, Rojava, and those who get it. We can live without the state, even if we don't get it. The old world's dying, build a new one instead. While I'm trying to kill that colonized white man living in my head, moving beyond ideological disputes. Don't tell me what you hate, tell me what you're gonna do. No politician's gonna save you. Bully, don't talk to me about build the party, let's just show me what the weeds at. Think outside the box, there's a million ways to fight back. Learn about a few on the motherfucking Soulcast. The Soulcast, a bi-weekly podcast at the end of every other week, available on the Channel Zero Podcast Network or wherever podcasts are found.
And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll call like a what?
Recent weeks, protests continue at a number of state capitals, demanding the reopening of the economy. In Michigan, armed protesters poured into the Capitol building. No masks, no social distancing. This push to reopen the economy has been championed by none other than our orange swindler and thief, as he mutters incoherently about possibly shooting up sick people with pine sol to fight coronavirus. Yeah, that guy. I suspect that as the weather gets better, these protests will get bigger. As dumb and as catastrophic as reopening the economy could be, I think this push demonstrates a few things. First, people are tired of being cooped up. Long-term isolation is not a picnic. Yeah, welcome to my world. But also, People need the money and want to get back to work before they lose everything. Most folks, even in the developed first world, already lived paycheck to paycheck before the coronavirus happened. Still further to this, I would suggest that on an even deeper level, people are feeling a loss of identity. We are, after all, part of a capitalist society, and we are what we do. When we introduce people, we often tell the person's name and what they do. This is Frank, he's a banker. Or, this is Susie, she's in real estate. Or, meet Trigger O'Cockenstein, he's in animal porn. See? We are, in this strange world, mostly identified by the labor we perform to earn food rewards. And when we stop being part of that process, when we are alienated from it, long into the foreseeable future, we lose our sense of who we are. We lose our purpose, our meaning. We feel stripped of our essential identities, and this creates an intolerable sense of nobodiness that can only be remedied by returning to the old daily grind. It doesn't occur to most of us that we would be much better off abandoning our identifications as labor units, that we would greatly benefit from conceiving of ourselves in our human relationships and in the things in life that give us joy and meaning. This is Frank. He loves playing with his kids. Or, this is Susie. You should see the pottery she creates. Or, meet Trigger O'Cockenstein. He's still into animal porn. I mean, not everyone is abandoning the Matrix, you know. Trigger might need more time. But as things are stacking up, he might want to hurry. There's this growing momentum to reopen the economy, but I suggest to you that the economy that reopens will not be the economy that closed. If the economic order that existed until this coronavirus outbreak is designated Global Economy 1.0, the economic order that will confront us when it relaunches will be Global Economy 2.0. To be prepared for the next potential outbreak, workspaces are going to be more socially distant, and that means fewer workspaces in public settings. More and more, to the extent possible, we're going to see workers operating from their homes. Our worlds will be much smaller. I would suggest that this will apply even to some kinds of manufacturing. With automation and with virtual reality, we can easily foresee a single human operating from home, wearing a virtual visor and gloves, and by moving his or her hands, moving the hands of the robot performing the actual labor in a factory miles and miles away. And while the initial expense in developing such virtual supervision and robotics might be expensive, the producer would save millions in the long run because one worker from home can essentially manage 3 or 5 or 10 robotic laborers, drastically downsizing the human labor market. This is true even in the service sector, where desk clerks, cashiers, and drive-through clerks can be replaced with automation. Even truck drivers, pilots, train engineers. Vast amounts of automation have been developed, a mind-boggling amount, but it hasn't been deployed yet. There was no across-the-spectrum need for such deployment. Now, there is. So as the economic order reopens, more and more workers over the next 18 months, even in optimum conditions, are going to find themselves downsized and outsourced. We're going to have a surplus labor population, primed for new levels of exploitation and drudgery. And that's if it goes as well as can be. Let's not forget, restarting an economy is something no one has ever done. So even the experts are perplexed. Add to that the fact that there's a jackwagon in the White House with a mind of a 9-year-old. And we can easily imagine him flipping switches and pulling levers and pushing buttons, all at random, on a whim, trying to get the cheese puffs rolling off the assembly line again. You might remember that when the system crashed in 2008, there was a jobless recovery. After coronavirus, we may very well face a recovery-less recovery. In other words, a system that ends up rebooting and grinding along without us. We might face a situation where we are no longer part of the economic order, that it is no longer measured by our well-being or by our prosperity, but by its own prosperity, independent of our very existence. It will be a corona-proof economy, one that can continue without our participation. That's bad. That's really bad. Once we're no longer necessary, once we're no longer needed, there's no reason to keep us around. There's no reason to keep us alive. There's no reason to work so hard to get ventilators to those of us who are sick. So the long and short of it is, if the ruling 1% scramble now to reset and reinvent the economy, and if they can get this rolling quickly, they don't just insulate themselves from COVID-19, but they create the dynamics where they can essentially allow COVID-20 or COVID-21 to burn through and wipe us all out and not bother stopping it. Fewer mouths to feed, more cheese puffs for them. Our interests, the interests of the vast majority of the human population, are not best served by sweating and toiling to restart the economy, but are best served by sabotaging it, by destroying it, by lighting it ablaze before it can ever get back on its feet. Now, more than ever, resistance is key. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain in quarantine at Buckingham Correctional in Dillwyn, Virginia. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at his latest address at Sean Swain, number 2015638, Buckingham Correctional, P.O. Box 430, Dillwyn, Virginia, 23936. You can find his past writings, recordings of his audio segments, and updates on his case at seanswain.org, or now follow him on Twitter at @SwainRocks. So I'm speaking with Wayne Price, a longtime anarchist, author, and currently a member of the Bronx Climate Justice North and Metropolitan Anarchist Coordinating Council, or MACC, in New York City. Thank you so much for taking this time to chat.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm delighted for a chance to talk to people.
Can you share a bit about the political trajectory, like your political development?
Let's see. Very briefly, I've had to change my mind more often than I like to admit. I began in high school as an anarchist pacifist. I was a great admirer of Paul Goodman and Dwight MacDonald at the time. I was persuaded of Trotskyism, of a radical democratic variety, a wing that rejected Trotsky's notion that the Soviet Union was somehow socialist because worker state, because it still had nationalized property. And over time, we went through various upheavals, and I eventually became a revolutionary anarchist, as I am today. Although I think that I still have much influenced by the more libertarian and humanistic tendencies in Marxism. That's where I am today.
I think it's really interesting how the RS, like the Revolutionary Socialist League, actually transitioned from an unorthodox Trotskyist group into basically an anarchist group before self-abolishing. Is that an okay description of what happened? Yeah,
although we were orthodox in an unorthodox way. That is, we never accepted, as I just said, the notion that the Soviet Union had become a
distorted worker state.
A worker state, and the various Orthodox Trotskyist belief that this worker state then spread to other countries without even a workers' revolution. So in that sense, we were always unorthodox. We regarded the Soviet Union correctly as a state capitalist. But we also were motivated by a desire for freedom. And we always we gave Marx and certainly Lenin and Trotsky the benefit of the doubt anytime there was a question of whether what they said could be interpreted in a more libertarian democratic fashion or in a more in the authoritarian fashion, until we stopped doing that. We were very much influenced by the gay liberation movement and women's liberation movements, not just for the content of that, but the spirit of a libertarian perspective. And all this led, at a certain point, we started thinking, here we were interpreting Trotskyism and Leninism and Marxism as in a libertarian, democratic, and humanistic working class fashion, and just about everybody else who was a Trotskyist, not to mention Leninist or Marxist, interpreted them in more authoritarian fashions, and in a way that they thought was good. So we thought, gee, is everybody wrong except, everybody marching in the wrong way except us? Or is it maybe that we're perhaps wrong, or perhaps maybe we're both right? Maybe there are authoritarian sides, aspects rooting the ideologies and all the Trotskyists around us and the Leninists and so forth. And this partly led us to, reevaluate. And certainly in my case, to go back to my anarchist roots, and other people, thought about this, and as a society generally, swung to the right after the end of the 60s and 70s, most of our people that we were in the group we were in, the Revolutionary Socialist League, most people just sort of dropped out of politics, but a few of us turned in an anarchist direction.
Did you find that any, when interacting with anarchists, that they would bring up any of Paul Averich's writings, or Maximoff or Volin, or any of these anarchists that either had been present during the repression of anarchists and the libertarian tendencies in Russia during the revolution, or other countries where state socialism or state capitalism had been imposed?
Sure, of course. And we also read some of that stuff. Average, who, by coincidence, had been a professor of mine at college, we read his stuff about Russia and read, started to read more about the Russian Revolution, going back to, reading Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman's accounts, and as well as Volin's account of the Russian Revolution and the Ukrainian Revolution and Makhno and so forth. And we got to see that, again, we had been giving them the benefit of the doubt, Lenin, but in fact that Lenin had created, Lenin was a Stalin. He hadn't intended to create a totalitarian state, but what he created was a one-party police state, he and Trotsky. Nor did they say, well, this is something we're having to do because of objective conditions, objective circumstances, the Civil War and so forth, but rather they came to see it as a principle, the one-party dictatorship. And we said, this is not what we want. This is not our conception. And so we started reanalyzing what was it about Lenin and Trotsky that had led to this. If you don't give them the benefit of the doubt on everything, you start seeing all sorts of authoritarian aspects.
This is The Final Straw Radio, and I'm Bursts, and you're hearing anarchist and author Wayne Price speak about anarchism, Marxism, capitalism, and alternatives to the current ecocidal regime. And so you've gone through this long trajectory in your personal development over the years, and you still believe that there's a lot to be learned from at least their progenitors, at least from Marx and Engels and their teachings on economic concepts. Like, for instance, the book that you wrote, The Value of Radical Theory, which I thought was quite enjoyable and really accessible. Can you talk a bit about...
How nice. Flattery will get you anywhere.
Well, can you talk a bit about Marxist economic theory, just in brief, and what you think a better grasp and engagement among anarchists could bring to our movements and our organizing? Well,
from the beginning, anarchists thought there was something valuable in Marx's economic analysis, more specifically precisely his critique of political economy, starting with Bakunin. In fact, somebody has referred to Bakunin as the first of the anarcho-Marxists. Particularly, both the historical materialism as a broad analysis of how society functions, and specifically the economic analysis of how capitalism functions, how capitalism works. And this shows us both the broad political, lays the basis for a working class orientation, for an understanding of the weaknesses of capitalism and the potentialities of the working class creating a new society, making a revolution. And it shows the positives and negatives of capitalism, both what causes the prosperity and the productivity, and the other hand, the crises that it's going to go through, and crises which we are now living through. I've always felt, and we analyzed capitalism as having gone through a period of big prosperity following World War II for various reasons, including the destructiveness of the war, the reorganization of world imperialism, the arms economy, the looting of the environment, treating oil and so forth as the basis of the economy, but treating it as something that's cheap and not having to pay for the full costs. And we could see that this would come to an end, and as it did in the late 70s, and began to the general downturn of the world economy with ups and downs. And we're now living through one example of the crash of the economy, although it doesn't show itself simply as a economic factor, but economic interrelated to other factors, particularly ecological and health, as we see. So I think it's very valuable to understand how the system works. And there really isn't an alternative to Marxist economics except bourgeois economics. So I regard that as very useful, and as long as we don't get lost in various aspects of it that tend in an authoritarian direction.
So I think that the term late-stage capitalism, I mean, you've kind of touched this already, but the term late-stage capitalism has always kind of like rankled me a little bit as a kind of a wishful phrase.
Yes.
But I guess if you think about capitalism as a cancer, and if we find ourselves in the world that we live in suffering from its latest stage, then that could mean that it's terminal for all of us. Or maybe, as real existing Marxists claim, we're ready for the next dialectical shift of the inevitable end of history. But what can you say about like what is coming? What in your crystal ball? What do you see is coming next, or what do you think we should be digging for?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, of course. And what's the phrase that Marxist economic analysis helped predict 9 of the last 4 recessions? After all, a toolkit is tools are no better than the workmen are using them. I also don't like the phrase late stage in the sense that it often was used by the Marxists to say that this is the end of capitalism, and we know that it's the end of capitalism, and we're right around and partly that was because they were so inspired, after all, by the spread of Stalinism, of state capitalism throughout the world, and they thought, well, that's going to keep on spreading until this is over. We don't know. It's ridiculous. We can no longer say that the socialism is inevitable, that the capitalist system will turn to socialism before there's a nuclear war, or before climate change disaster hits the world, or before total collapse of the economy, or whatever. That's nobody can really make that claim now, and it would sound absurd. I do think capitalism has a tendency towards its destruction. I think it's has reached its limits in a basic sense, but that doesn't mean that you can predict it. It's like saying that, we can predict that there's going to be a humongous earthquake in California due to the plate tectonics, but do we know when? We don't even know what century it'll happen in. Unfortunately, the greatest immediate threat is the climate change, and that's bearing down upon us like a railroad train coming down on us in a tunnel. But we can't know exactly what's going to happen. The system is very flexible. It has been very able to revive itself after every crash. I think Lenin once said that there's no crisis that the capitalists can't find a way out of. In theory, we don't know. I expect things to get really much worse. I expect that we're facing crashes and collapses, and due to the climate, due to health, as well as the economic collapse, which we're now seeing. If there is a revolutionary change, I don't know how drawn out it would be. That's really impossible to say.
Many anarchists avoid painting a clear picture of their visions of alternative economic systems. In fact, many of the most inspirational pictures of what anti-authoritarian post-capitalist alternative that I've come across come from science fiction stories like This Fifth Sacred Thing or Woman on the Edge of Time. Drawing back to reality a bit, though, can you paint a picture of what you think an alternative post-capitalist economy that you imagine happening and functioning might look like? What some of the moving parts in it might be, or how it might relate geographically? Well,
we have some ideas. I expect people to, in some way, form a federation of or association of self-managed industries, workplaces, communities, and to coordinate with each other and build a democratic planning from below through voluntary associations. Exactly how, I don't know, because the key part of the vision is that it's going to be experimental, that people and pluralistic and decentralized. So people will try out different things in different places. Some places might try to go immediately to full communism immediately. Others might try to use market mechanisms. Some areas, regions be more centralized, others more decentralized. It'll be an experimental kind of society with people using intelligence and seeing how it works out. The key thing is that it will be self-governing, self-managed, cooperative, organized by the people from bottom up, and flexible and spreading throughout the whole world. It'll involve at first, of course, it'll be the working people who have to take over. I'm not against the notion of saying that the workers will take power. I'm against the notion of the workers taking state power. That is, what will replace the existing state will be the self-organization of the people, of the working class and all oppressed, as they move to building a society which has no division between classes. There's no specialization of who's of managers and managed, rulers and ruled, and so forth. So we can imagine, think in terms of federations and networks of consumer and producer cooperatives and self-governing communes economically, and coordination through councils and assemblies, from neighborhood assemblies and workplace councils, the replacement of police and military by a popular militia and armed people coordinating through their councils for so long as this is necessary. Something like that. That's very vague, I know. I'm saying it very briefly. But that's basically the vision of a stateless, classless, revolutionary new society.
It kind of seems like there's a pragmatism for like materialists of various sorts to be pointing to working people as one of the main groups of people that have agency because of their ability to either put down their tools or immediately like block production from occurring. But in an economy like currently, where so much of the employment that people engage with is not economic, it's not producing food, a lot of that's automated on large farms. It's not manufacturing, where a lot of that is automated, or is so globalized that the production doesn't occur locally. Do you think that there needs to be a shift in people's understanding of, or what's the working definition of the working class or proletariat that you would use?
Well, about, what was it to say, 80% of the population lives paycheck to paycheck. They take orders from somebody and don't give orders to anybody else. They are the goods of the society. It's true, the industrialized sector, in terms of employment, has decreased, though it's hardly gone. Nevertheless, they still produce as much as we ever produced in this country, as you say, partly because of automation. Also, the main point here that people who don't work in factories work in service industries. The people who work in Amazon, you won't call it a factory, but they're concentrated in large industrial sites where they're pushing goods around. That's not counting such things as, a major thing in the news now is the coronavirus spreading to the meatpacking plants, which are big factories and which are central to the diet of the American people. So, yeah, a lot of people work in, or did work in restaurants and small places, but still most people work for a living, and they work for a paycheck, and they either called a salary or a wage, and that's still true for most people. And even those who don't work, they're either blue collar or white collar, or pink collar for women's classified, categorized work. That's still true. It hasn't changed. So we don't have the robots running everything just yet. Meanwhile, on a world scale, as you say, one of the reasons for the decrease in certain industrialized jobs is because jobs have gone elsewhere. This is not the end of the working class. It's rather the working class has been restructured. Where it used to be that most of the world was peasants, today most of the world is urban, including vast expansion of the international working class. That doesn't counter a working class analysis to say that the growth of the working class throughout the world, in China and Vietnam and Mexico and Bangladesh and Africa and so forth, there's now an international proletariat in the way there hasn't been before. So now that's not to say that this is the only issue, the exploitation and oppression of the workers, because all issues of oppression are relevant. And just as in the past, in Marx's day, or Lenin, the aim was to not only mobilize the workers, but also, say, the peasants or oppressed nations. So today, every issue of oppression and suffering is relevant and has to be brought into a revolutionary movement. Oppression of women, gay, lesbians, bisexual, and so forth, people, youth, and of course the issues of ecology and so forth. All these issues, everything is relevant. But the working class, as you said, part of this is certainly not a moral thing. It's not that workers are more oppressed than, say, deaf people. There is a strategic point. Who has the power to change things? Who has their hands on the means of production and transportation and so forth and so on? The state has most of the military power, obviously, although the rank and files of the military is sons and daughters of the working class. But the workers also have the capacity to shut things down and start things up again in a different way. So this is a particularly strategic aspect that ties in together with, and they overlap with every other oppression. It's not like a African-American woman worker, postal worker, say, is oppressed a certain number of hours as a worker and a certain number of hours as black and a certain number of hours as a woman. It's all together. It's one ball of wax, Even when she's not working, she's depending on the income she gets from her job. So these aren't separate issues. They're all interconnected, and the central thing that holding it all together is capitalism and its exploitation, because without the surplus that it squeezes out of the working population, there would be no capitalism, there would be no state, there would be no male oppression, there would be no nothing. So this is for strategic reasons, this is a central issue, the class issue.
Hi, this is Rachel from the leasing office, and we've noticed there's been a lot of noise coming from Unit 301, a lot of partying, a lot of mess, and you haven't paid your rent yet. Can someone please give us a call back, because at this point, I think you guys need to leave.
Dear landlord, girl, I think you must be bored. Saw your notice on my door, but I tossed it on the floor. See, Miss COVID came and shut us down, so like it's our time to party now. So ma'am, I'm saying this as nice as I can. Fuck the rent, I just got fired, so you ain't getting a cent. And next to me, let's check they sent already spent. Oh girl, I said what I said, and that's what I meant. Fuck the rent. Cause I'm staying here, but honey, I'm not paying. You ain't getting my money, what I'm saying, I say it again. Fuck the rent.
Hi, it's Rachel again. We just got a call from a neighbor complaining about excessive barking, which is odd because you're in our no pets wing. I took the liberty of watching your Insta stories, and I know that you're quarantining here, so call me back, or I'm calling the cops.
I've got 2 cats, a dog, a ferret, but no pet deposit. I've been a rebel since the devil strutted out of the closet. So bend over, I'll show you where to put your noise complaints. And if you think you're gonna evict us, let me tell you, you ain't. Fuck the rent. It's just below me, so you ain't getting a cent. And next to me, let's check they sent already spent. Oh girl, I said what I said, and that's what I meant. Fuck the rent. Cause I'm staying here, but honey, I'm not paying. But I do pay my dancers. I'm just saying, I say it again. Fuck the rent, fuck the rent, fuck the rent. 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 Call some other tenant's phone if you need to rent. Fuck the rent. You're embarrassing yourself, can't you take a hand? Fuck the rent. Cause I said what I said and that's what I meant. Fuck the rent. Cause I'm staying here, but honey, I'm not paying. You ain't getting my money, what I'm saying, I say it again. Fuck the rent, fuck the rent, fuck the rent.
Hi, it's Rachel again, and I just wanted you guys to know that I quit that job. I hate that fucking place, so if you guys want to party, let a bitch know. Also, are you looking for a roommate?
This is The Final Straw Radio, and I'm Bursts, and you're hearing anarchist and author Wayne Price speak about anarchism, Marxism, capitalism, and alternatives to the current ecocidal regime. So you've mentioned ecological destruction as a product of capitalist industrial production.
Mm-hmm.
And definitely a critique of so-called socialist economies was that they were similarly widely polluting, damaging, extractive, or continue to be in the case of China, which still calls itself that, and poisoning of human and non-human life. Why would anarchist models of economy be any different, being sprouted from the same soil, even in rejection of liberal capitalism, but some of the concepts of extraction and looking at the world around us as resources? And are there any more modern anarchist thinkers or tendencies or groups that you feel influence your thoughts on this?
Well, it's always been the point is not industry as such. The point is capitalism. Capitalism has a drive to accumulate, to quantitative growth, accumulation of value and surplus value, and to reduce everything to the same metric, to value, to money, and commodities, and has a drive to accumulate. Marx says accumulation, that's Moses and the prophets to capitalism. And that essentially causes, on the one hand, that gave it progressive sides, especially in its early days, producing machinery and the possibility of a life of plenty for all. But on the other hand, it, by definition, does not fit in, it contradicts the need for a balanced, ecologically balanced society with human beings living in harmony with nature. Under a society, a socialist democracy of anarchy, when the working people run society, they may make mistakes. They may have areas with a conflict with the environment, but there's nothing inherent in the system that drives it to conflict with the environment. There's no drive to accumulation, to greater quantitative growth, and so forth. So it certainly becomes possible to reorganize the technology and the economy in ways that fit in with the environment without there'll be things that have to be produced. Certainly we'll want to bring out, say, parts of the so-called third world, particularly Africa and parts of Asia and Latin America, out of the direst poverty. At the same time, the overproduction of commodities, the production that exists in the imperialist countries, the production of the military production, all that will be unnecessary and can be reorganized. We'll have to reorganize the technology, obviously. We start with what we have on the day of the revolution, let's say, but then we'll have to be working people will have to decide, well, how will we reorganize it? For one thing, we want to reorganize it so it's no longer run from the top down by a minority of capitalists or bureaucrats. On the other hand, and create a democratic, self-managed economy. On the other hand, we want to rebuild, as I say, the poverty-stricken parts of the world, but we also want to create an ecology and a technology that fits in with the ecology, that makes a cycle that we're what we use is recreated and so forth. Lastly, I'd say that I wouldn't regard the so-called socialist countries as socialist. They were I regard them as state capitalist, because the basic drive to accumulation of capital existed, even though there was no stocks and bonds, but there was a collective bureaucracy that served as a center for capital accumulation and using the state for capital accumulation, and which exploited the workers in essentially the same way as the workers have been exploited in the West.
And it's interesting to see what the dissolution of those nation states and economies proper under those terms of being socialist into the post-Soviet era, how much it's a lot of the same people that run the factories.
Switch from one variety of capitalism to another.
And it's even the same bureaucrats that were running whatever factory that oftentimes end up becoming the owner of the private company afterwards, right?
That's right. And we can see also it both fell apart and developed in the Soviet, so-called Soviet bloc, and the same thing in China, although there it was done more deliberately under the control of the so-called Communist Party. They have a Communist Party, they have a People's Liberation Army, they have a great deal of government ownership that still exists. Nevertheless, it's so obvious that it's now run through the market and through a capitalist system. And it was all done without a explicit revolution. Normally you expect if this had really been a socialist society and it was counter-revolution occurred to capitalism, there would have some great upheavals and revolution, and it didn't happen in either of these countries.
So, switching gears a little bit, I'd like to talk a bit about platformism and how it developed and what it looks like today, particularly in the U.S. And I bring this up because you've written for a while for a website called Anarchismo, which is a part of a network. And I'm not sure if you affiliate with Black Rose Federation or any other platformist or a pacifist organization, but I'd kind of like to learn a little bit about what ways forward to that alternative economy do you see coming from this tendency?
Well, from the beginning of anarchism, there's always been a conflict between those who just see themselves as loose individuals and those who see the need for organizing anarchists into a specific grouping, organization that would raise and fight for a particular program. This goes back to at least to Bakunin, after all, who formed the Alliance for Socialist Democracy when he was in the First International. And in fact, that was a major complaint of Marx against Bakunin, was the formation of an anarchist grouping inside the organization. And ever since then, there have been those who aim to form an anarchist organization. And the question, just how to do it and how decentralized it would be and how federalized it would be. I believe in the need for that those revolutionary anarchists who have general agreement should form themselves into some kind of democratic federation in order to develop their ideas better, in order to coordinate their activities, in order to fight for their particular program, as against, after all, the fact that all the bad guys are organized. The Stalinists, the Marxist-Leninists, the liberals and the fascists and the reformists, everybody is organized and fighting for their program, and I think anarchists should do that too. Sometimes it's called pro-organization anarchism or dual organization anarchism, dual being because anarchists should organize themselves as well as participate in broader organizations, heterogeneous groups like unions and community groups and anti-war movements and so on and so forth. So this was the idea raised by Makhno and Arsenov and some others after the Russian Revolution, when some of the anarchists, they got together and said, why were the Bolsheviks able to beat us out and create their system when anarchists were influential in various ways during the revolution? And they said, well, at least one of the reasons, if not the only one, but one of the major reasons was because they out-organized us. And it was important we should be organizing ourselves. And this is the key idea. They wrote something, what they call it was the draft platform for anarchists or whatever. So those who agreed with that became known as platformists. Other groups, there have been various arguments about this, pro and con, but the basic idea of anarchists organizing themselves, those who agree with each other, revolutionary anarchists, to fight for a program is, I think, an essential point of view. It is in this country particularly raised by the Black Rose Federation. Right now I'm retired. I'm not, so to speak, I'm not a member of any organization, but I generally support their activities, and I think they're going in the right direction as far as that goes.
Love and Rage, which you were a part of, also another federation, did it consider itself a cadre organization? And how does the idea of a cadre relate to like a common, like shared points of unity around a platform?
We never use the word cadre.
Okay.
Partly, if what one means is an organization of, by cadre you mean militants, people committed to revolutionary anarchism, then yes. On the other hand, if you mean people who are heavily disciplined and top-down organized and so forth, then certainly not. So we were a kind of loose federation. Some people wanted to make it even looser and they wanted to make a network. We said, no, we want to make a federation based on a program and so forth. And that's what we did. We put out a newspaper regularly, that continental-wide, that went from Mexico to throughout the United States and then to Canada. But there were various political disagreements. It was very loose grouping, and a problem with anarchists, of course, is theoretical unity, to pull ourselves together on that, and there was disagreements, and also the movement started going downhill for a while, and it fell apart. Some people looking for, in Love and Rage, some people decided to look in the direction of a more centralized and authoritarian perspective, abandoning anarchism for some kind of Maoism. And we had a kind of a faction fight inside about that, those of us who objected to that. So the thing fell apart. But that was after, I don't know how many years was that?
Like 9 years?
I don't remember. About 9 years. So for 9 years it was successful, at least, in having an impact on the scene. So I'm rather proud of that. And the movement continued on after that.
Well, I'm sorry for the mischaracterization of cadre. That's like how it had been explained to me by someone that I knew who was affiliated with it at one point. That's the term that they had used. But maybe they went towards the Maoist direction themselves.
I think that's somebody's conclusion looking back on it. I don't think at the time we used the term.
So you said that you're retired, but are you also still, was I incorrect in saying that you affiliate with MACC?
Yes. Although MACC is so loose an organization that it doesn't have official membership. But I support it and go to participate in it, the study groups and various discussions and various activities.
Well, would you call it a synthesist organization?
Well, I don't know. The term implies when it has integrated different perspectives, or even that tries to in this. It's as an organization, it has different. There is no clear MACC ideology or program. So, if you regard yourself as an anarchist, you should join MACC. I think we would draw the line at, say, an so-called anarchist capitalists. But outside of that, it's pretty open. It's not that there's a deliberate attempt to synthesize different perspectives. It's just the de facto who joins. So,
okay,
it's too grand to call it a synthesis organization.
So you mentioned reading groups. What other sort of projects does MACC affiliate with?
They're involved in support for immigrants, support for prisoners, support and involvement in various, in at least one labor struggle in the city. I've seen off the top of my head. Right now, trying to help the formation of mutual aid groups to help people in this time of crisis. Spreading out the ideas and concepts of a rent strike right now. Individuals involved in podcast production. The Rebel
Steps.
That's right. So, and a bunch of other things. It's hard for people trying to put together a book, a collection of writings on anarchism. There's a propaganda grouping. So, a wide range of activities.
That's awesome. This is The Final Straw Radio, and I'm Bursts, and you're hearing anarchist and author Wayne Price. speak about anarchism, Marxism, capitalism, and alternatives to the current ecocidal regime. So I was going to bring up the article. You recently wrote a piece about the U.S. presidential elections for the Anarcho-Syndicalist Review entitled An Election in Hell. It took a pretty traditionally anarchist stance on electoral participation, which is promoting abstention and alternatively direct action. So while many anarchists say that the parties are the same and that participation doesn't matter, though it seems clear that elections deeply affect the people who live most marginalized in our society, whether because of the effects of racialization, gendering, ableism, neurodivergence, nation of birth, etc., ethnicity, and the ways that those lines intersect with class. We also see that more conservative and reactionary wing of politics in the U.S., namely the Republicans, is constantly pushing to divest the vote from those groups that I named up above in favor of white, Christian, property-owning, straight, and cis men. So it's not really fair to say that elections don't have an impact, right? So I'm wondering if you could sort of bring out a little more about your perspective around the impacts of elections, like what participation means, and if it really is like unwise to just vote for the least threatening possible potential enemies, as in like if we got Sanders in or if we got Biden in, they might be easier to push against or organize against than say like a Trump.
Well, first of all, let me be clear. I do not tell people not to vote. That's up to them.
Yeah.
What isolated individuals do, whether they vote or not, I really don't give a damn. The likelihood of your individual vote making an impact isn't all that much. It's, and I certainly don't, argue with my friends and family and coworkers when I was working, saying, well, don't vote. And I certainly wouldn't deny that the Democrats are the lesser of two evils. My argument is really about what should mass groups do, large progressive groupings and sections of the population and or let alone mass organizations. What should the unions do? What should the black community as a community do? Other communities of color, Latinx and organized LGBTQ people. What should the organized environmental movement do, or the organized women's movement do? These groups put a lot of money and human effort into campaigning and phone calling and phone banking and contacting people, and much of the effort, in fact, they're pretty much the basis of the Democratic Party. I would say they are the Democratic Party, except for the fact the Democratic Party doesn't have a membership, but in fact is dominated and run by the politicians and the big donors. I advocate for them that what they do as an organizations should be to stop supporting the Democratic Party or any electoral party and put their efforts into direct action, mass action, union organizing, community organizing, mass strikes, demonstrations, civil disobedience. Most of the progress that this country has made has been done through outside of the electoral system, by non-electoral activities. Whether you think of the 30s labor struggles, mass strikes that brought us the progressive aspects of the New Deal and the unionization, or the civil rights movement with the mass civil disobedience, which is a nice way of saying law-breaking, and the so-called riots, or the anti-war movement, which was mostly mass demonstrations and college strikes and civil disobedience and virtual mutiny inside the army, and so on throughout history. These are the direction that I would build up, that I think was more useful. The elections are, the Democratic Party in particular, is a place where mass movements go to die. That's what happens to most mass movements, that they get sucked into the Democratic Party to be efficient, and then they're killed off. One reason why it's been so hard to build anything right now. Now, I certainly don't deny, well, let me put it this way. The problem with the strategy of supporting the lesser of two evils is that things just keep on getting more evil. The history of politicians in this country of presidents has been that there's one reactionary Republican who then is defeated by a Democrat who's more or less moderate or liberal or whatnot, who's then followed by another even more reactionary Republican, who's then defeated by another Democrat, who's then followed by another reactionary Republican. And we've now gotten ourselves into after all, this whole system, this whole approach has produced now the very worst of all. This is not a viable long-term strategy. I agree that elections, in the short-term, elections might make a difference. In the long-term, this country is not run by elections. It isn't elections that make the final difference. It's whether or not there's going to be a mass movement to fight against the reactionary aspects of the society. The Republicans are the cutting edge of the knife of the attack on the working class and oppressed people and black people and women and so forth. But the Democrats are, up there on the ballot. They're up there on the knife also, just behind the Republicans.
Well,
am I making myself clear? Or
no, I think that's perfectly clear. Well, I was just going to ask, and if you have anything else that you want to talk about, I've kept you talking for a while. I've really enjoyed the conversation, but I was going to ask where people can find your work. Is there a platform that you specifically publish on, or where people can follow you?
Well, a lot of my articles have been published, as you said, in Anarchismo, www.anarchismo with a KANARKISMO.net. And then most of my articles published over the years can be found there. Some of my back articles that are listed are published in the Anarchist Library under Wayne Price. I also write for Utopian Journal and also for, as you said, the Anarchist Syndicalist Review. I have a series of articles have been published there. And I have 3 books that have been published, as you mentioned, one book on the political economy and 2 other books that can be looked up.
Well, thank you very much. Is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you'd like to mention for the audience or discuss?
I can't think of offhand.
Okay.
There are so many topics to talk about.
Yeah, that's true.
Let me say this, that right now we see certainly the system collapsing for the moment. We're in very bad days. The notion that the system was going to... If I thought that the system was going to be restore itself, get back into balance, and then I'd say that really the chances of making a revolutionary change are pretty small. But I don't believe that. I think while things may improve, it'll collapse even further. It'll go up and down, but the long-range trend is one catastrophe after another. And the politics of this country have been reflecting the basic crisis. The middle is falling away. So that on the one hand, you have out-and-out fascists marching in the streets, a president who can't even bring himself to directly criticize them, and on the right, and on the left, you have the growth of people, movement of people calling themselves socialists. Something like polls are showing they're up to a big minority, up to about something like 30 to 40% of the population identifies, regards themselves as being socialist or pro-socialist. And we saw with Sanders running, a large number of people who were either calling themselves socialist or at least were willing to vote for somebody who called themselves socialist. They're pretty vague about what that means, and to the extent that there's a actually developed program, it's reformist state socialism, which I think is totally inadequate for the crisis, and at its worst could lead to state capitalism and oppression. But it shows there's a change, there's an opening for a far left, for revolutionary anarchist socialists to revolutionary libertarian socialists, libertarian communists to make a point to argue for their position and to organize. If we pull ourselves together, if we have an organization, and we build movements to build a really revolutionary perspective that can make a difference. So there's hope. There's great danger, and I have no idea whether this will happen in time before some terrible collapse or calamity. But there's certainly hope in there's certainly things that open things up in the direction of change. So we should look at the positive side as far as that goes.
Yeah, the idea of trying to restart the economy, whatever the hell that means, I don't think it's ever really been done from a full stop before, but it seems to open up a lot of possibility.
That's right. Yes, I think so. People are reconsidering what they mean and what kind of life they want and how society should be organized. And of course, most people will try to bring back to quote unquote normal, except there's never going to be another normal. That's what it means. You know, what Biden says, talks about he's going to get rid of Trump, and we go back to normal. Of course, it was that very normal that caused so many people to be dissatisfied and to be channeled into support for Trump in the first place. Mm-hmm. But it isn't going to go back to normal. Crises will continue, and people will be looking for alternatives. And in that, it's very important for revolutionary anarchists to be raising their alternatives, to be talking something about the possibility of a different way of living, a different way of human beings relating to each other, a different way of organizing society. That is what gives me hope.
Do you think that, like, if there are people that might think about like a UBI type idea as being an alternative or as like a positive step forward? We've seen little bits of this with the small portions of the population that have actually gotten a stimulus check. But, you know, even in the name, it says stimulus. It's meant to be spent in order to get small businesses running. But do you think that a UBI is anything that actually could get passed? And it doesn't seem to sit very well with the revolutionary perspective, does it?
Well, it's certainly we're not against. Revolutionary shouldn't be against all reforms. The difference what's a reformist is not somebody who's for reforms. A reformist is somebody who thinks reforms are sufficient, who thinks that if we just keep on doing reforms, that either that's good enough or that somehow by gradually doing reforms, they will evolve into a new society without ever having to make a revolutionary transformation. I'm for reform. Certainly, the idea of a guaranteed income for everybody is a basic communistic kind of concept. For that very reason, I don't think it would pass in this society, such as it is. We don't even have as much... we can't even get universal health passed. Even Biden was not for a universal health plan. So, but I'm all for it. We should certainly call for it. That they could barely get past this little inadequate lump sum payment to the population, while they're putting out vast sums of money for the rich and for the big corporations.
And all the while, the numbers of death in the United States are like outpacing everywhere else in the world. We really are the greatest, you know. And
we have got the most, unfortunately, most incompetent government that we've had in decades in the world. It's not inherited capitalism to have such an incompetent government, but it's not. It's certain, but on the other hand, it is consistent with the history of this country. With certainly recent history, we've had some really. We've went from Reagan to Bush, who is not the sharpest pencil in the block, and to this idiot. Mm-hmm. So that's been really, compounding this disaster.
Well, on that happy note, thank you so much for the chat. I've really enjoyed it.
Me too. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
And I hope you stay healthy, you and yours.
Healthy. All right. Stay healthy and happy.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Goodness. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.